To actualize this vision and unlock potential, we require carbon markets that actually work for ordinary people in African communities. These markets will become reality under frameworks that prioritize the rapid and significant reduction of transaction costs. Currently, 80% of value of some green credits are captured by intermediaries, leaving only a fraction for the communities undertaking the actual hard work on the ground. It will also be fundamental for us, for such framework to effectively define methodologies and approaches to properly recognize and reward a broader range of measures through which Kenya, and indeed other African countries, contribute to fighting climate change. It is imperative to also develop modalities for the proper valuation of existing carbon sinks before they fall under imminent threats such as deforestation and other forms of degradation. We recognize that our expectations are massive, but the opportunity before us is tremendous. We can, and indeed must, rise to the demands of the moment and seize it with both hands. Kenya therefore looks forward to working with initiatives such as the Africa Carbon Markets Initiative in substantially expanding carbon markets and carbon credit opportunities in our country and throughout the continent of Africa. I thank you. A portion of the proceeds from these credits have been invested towards funding clean cooking and solar home systems. The dividend of the emerging circularly exemplify the vision of the global conservation movement. I am pleased to share encouraging news of an exemplary Kenyan project, which is the first and largest in the world, focusing entirely on soil carbon removals through sustainable grazing management. It is on course towards its inspiring target of removing up to 50 million tons of carbon dioxide from the ecosystem over the next 30 years. All evidence and projections indicate that we are still only scratching the surface of Kenya's potential. Some estimates suggest that by 2030, Kenya will be generating over 30 million tons of carbon credits annually, thereby earning hundreds of millions of dollars as incomes and creating hundreds of thousands of green jobs for our young people. These resources, promised under this demonstrably feasible scenario, would accelerate a range of initiatives in areas such as landscape restoration, expansion of forest cover, tree growing, clean cooking, and agroforestry. Kenya is already bearing the brunt of climate change, whose adverse effects now impact every aspect of our economies and livelihoods. The climate crisis further complicates national roadmaps towards socio-economic transformation and impedes the achievement of sustainable development goals in our continent. As I speak to you, Kenya is in the throes of a harrowing food insecurity caused by 2 consecutive years of failed rain. Most of the country has been affected, and we have had to provide emergency relief to 4.3 million citizens to prevent suffering from hunger and starvation. Kenya, and by extension the Horn of Africa, is experiencing the worst drought in 40 years. Prevailing trends in the global warming signals that even more difficult times lie ahead on account of associated climate crisis. I stand here to make the strong case that despite all this, we in Africa, and more specifically in Kenya, are more than just climate victims. I wish to persuade you that our strengths by far surpasses our weaknesses, and that our potential to make substantial positive global contributions overwhelmingly exceed our need for assistance. Our people have the potential to play a unique, indispensable, and globally significant role in the prevention and mitigation of emissions, protection of crucial ecosystems, and the restoration of precious carbon sinks. The urgent actualization of this critical intervention offers humanity its best chance of prevailing in the existential contest with climate change-induced catastrophe. The good news is that the world has a golden opportunity to rapidly achieve these objectives by developing a robust, transparent, and sustainable mechanism through which a carbon credit market can yield attractive income and development opportunities for communities at the front line in the fight against climate change. We will align incentives among polluting producers and sequestration enterprises to achieve net zero industrialization and shared green prosperity. Kenya is already a leader in the generation of carbon credits in Africa, accounting for over 20% of Africa's volume over the past 5 years. Although we are just getting started and the scale remains modest, the beneficial impact of the nascent carbon credit regime holds tremendous promise. The UNEP's Emission Gap Report 2022 corroborates and confirms that given insufficient current efforts, warming will further rise to 2.8%, and we are staring at a runaway warming effect whose consequences will certainly be unforgiving. The gravity of the matter cannot be overstated. Our global situation is dire. We must mobilize to do the right thing as a matter of urgency. There is no more room to ignore, evade, or delay calls for substantial cuts in emissions, especially by the big emitters. Unless significant emission reduction is achieved rapidly, the adaptation gap continues to widen. In the last 12 months, since COP26 in Glasgow, extreme weather records have been broken on every continent, from the worst drought in 40 years currently ravaging the Horn of Africa, including Kenya, to the devastating floods that hit Pakistan and more recently Nigeria, and the worst European drought in 500 years, heat waves, wildfires in many parts of the globe. The litany of disastrous climate impacts continue. These calamities have been more pronounced and destructive in vulnerable countries, especially in Africa. In the IPCC's sixth assessment report paints a grim picture going forward if urgent climate measures are not undertaken now. The window for action is fast closing, and the onus squarely falls upon the current world leaders to stand up as the generation that can be counted on to take hard decisions, but to do the right thing. We cannot afford to continue ignoring the urgent warnings of science. Ladies and gentlemen, effective response to climate change requires adequate and predictable financing, capacity building, technology development and transfer. Climate finance remains the single most critical enabler in unlocking climate action and especially addressing adaptation in vulnerable communities of the global south. Between 2019 and 2020, a total of $11.4 billion has been made available to Africa for adaptation against an estimated need of $579 billion in adaptation investment by 2030. Clearly, this level of financing falls far short of what is required to build resilience in Africa. I call upon the developed parties to meet all their pledges. This includes doubling of the adaptation finance agreed upon in Glasgow and the urgent implementation of the $100 billion commitment. Quite clearly, these funds are inadequate for purposes of adaptation in Africa, as well as covering loss and damage as confirmed by the IPCC 6th Assessment Report. The report emphatically confirms that loss and damage is happening now, and I add that all the phenomena that characterizes or inflicts loss and damage have sadly become the lived experience of many African communities. My elder brother, the President of Senegal, for putting together this AAAP that is providing a framework for adaptation and mitigating the effects of climate change, which has emerged as one of the greatest threats to life on Earth. It is also a serious challenge to human well-being globally, with particular intensity in the African continent. The 6th Assessment Report of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, published in 2021, has singled out Africa as singularly vulnerable to climate change and weather extremes. Such vulnerability poses serious adverse repercussions for Africa's precarious socio-economic systems, even though the continent's countries cumulatively contribute only 4% of average global emissions. It is imperative that urgent measures be taken to effectively cushion Africa's people, their livelihoods, economies, and communities, and rapidly eradicate vulnerability. It is for this reason that accelerating adaptation is a matter of high priority throughout Africa. The escalation of global warming is worsening climate impacts, putting our countries at risk of adaptation limits being quickly overwhelmed, leading to unbearable loss and damage. Every slight increase in warming has far-reaching and often irreversible negative effects. Failure to redeem these pledges, therefore, implicates the leadership of the developed countries of negligence with dire humanitarian consequences. This is an action moment, a financial moment, and a moral moment for global leadership. We must rise to meet it without flinching. It is in this spirit that I therefore call for the speedy capitalization of existing climate finance mechanisms, that is both under the Convention and Paris Agreement. I also call for the development of innovative modalities to mobilize additional climate financing. The operationalization of carbon markets under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement would go a long way in this respect. Finally, I emphasize the need for funding under these frameworks to be adequate, timely, and accessible in order to be effective. Successful adaptation is not about making incremental or piecemeal investments. Rather, it is about understanding, intending, and doing development differently. It is about systematically taking account of both present and future climate risks. Adaptation and development are inextricably linked and reciprocal, and credible adaptation actions deliver considerable development outcomes. Accordingly, the achievement of the Africa Union's Agenda 2063 will require African countries to rapidly accelerate the implementation of adaptation plans. I urge all of us to make this COP the implementation COP. Let us all be mindful that we are in a potential existential moment, if not for all humanity, then most certainly for many communities, especially vulnerable people in developing countries, including Africa. Our negotiations are not all about hard-nosed bargaining for financial commitments. Due recognition of the distinct moral component underlying our proceedings should convince us to tone down hard, zero-sum positions, direct our focus to collective problem-solving, and enable us to develop resolutions that will lead to a successful COP27. As an African COP, let us make Sharm el-Sheikh the COP of effective decisions, resolute implementation, and ambitious action. I thank you.